Hello there, welcome to Danny Night Stories. I'm here to help you relax whether you are sleeping or just want to rest. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now relax and enjoy. Minecraft Horror Story: The Fog That Destroys. Chapter 5: The Player Who Came Back. Steve remained inside the windowless house until the square sun had cleared the horizon. For a little while he did nothing more dangerous than organize his inventory. He counted his food, repaired his shield, and placed the tear of the man in the final slot of his hotbar. The ordinary actions steadied him. Wood still became sticks. Coal still lit a furnace. Whatever had changed in the world, its smallest rules remained dependable. Outside, the morning was quiet. Fog covered the plains in a smooth white layer, but the circle carved into the floor held it 1 block away. Steve ate a cooked salmon, wrote the house coordinates inside the plain book, and closed the cover. Something whistled in the distance. The note was not the man's low warning. This tune contained 4 short tones, rising and falling in the pattern Mason always used when searching separate mine tunnels. 2 notes meant iron, 3 meant lava, 4 meant come here. Steve stepped through the broken wall. Fog surrounded the house but did not touch him. The tear in his hand gave off a faint blue glow, and the pale air withdrew from it in a circle 3 blocks wide. Wherever Steve walked, the ground became visible. Wherever he stopped, the fog pressed close around the boundary. The tear revealed more than the path. As Steve crossed the erased plains, pieces of the old world flickered inside its blue light. A fence appeared for 1 second and vanished beneath his hand. 3 wheat plants rose from the dirt, fully grown, then became pale outlines. The shadow of an iron golem passed across the road, even though no golem remained. At the first empty village plot, an entire house returned around him. Steve stood inside the missing cartographer's room. Maps covered the walls. A villager worked at the table while rain tapped the glass. The vision had no color except blue, and none of its objects could be touched. It was a memory preserved inside the tear. The cartographer stopped working. He looked directly at Steve and pointed behind him. Steve turned. The room vanished. Only the foggy plains remained. Fresh footprints crossed the road behind him. They were longer than player steps and ended 3 blocks from where he stood. Steve held the tear closer. More fragments appeared. The hilltop roof, Mason's unfinished dock, the grey cat sleeping on the furnace. Furnace opened its eyes and watched something beyond the memory's window. The cat hissed. Every fragment broke apart. For an instant, a tall shadow occupied the blue circle with Steve. The tear became painfully cold. He swung his axe, but the shadow was gone before the blade reached it. After that, Steve stopped using the tear to search the erased homes. Memories could show what the fog had taken. They could also show the fog exactly where he was looking. The 4-note whistle came again from the west. "Mason?" Steve called. There was no reply in voice chat. He followed the sound. The old plains had become almost featureless. Grass remained underfoot, but every flower, tree, and placed torch was gone. The path appeared only when the tear pushed the fog aside. It ran west in a broken line toward the village. Steve passed the pit Mason had used to trap the hunter. The opening had been filled with ordinary dirt. No dripstone waited below, and no dropped arrows remained. The fog had erased the evidence of their fight as neatly as a player resetting a chunk. After 200 blocks, Steve found an oak sign standing in the road. It read this way: The lettering belonged to Mason. He always centered his words and used capital letters when leaving directions. An arrow pointed west. Steve continued. A second sign waited at the edge of the birch forest. Do not turn around. Steve stopped. The fog pressed close on every side. He held the tear forward and listened. No footsteps followed him. No whistle came from behind. He turned around. The man stood at the limit of the tear's light. His eyes were white. His barred mouth was closed. Fog joined his black body so completely that he seemed cut from it, a narrow absence in the world. Steve kept looking at him and backed toward the forest. The creature did not move. The four-note whistle sounded ahead. Steve did not answer. He kept his crosshair on the man until the figure dissolved into the fog without changing shape. Only when the last white square of its eyes had disappeared did Steve face west again. Someone stood beside the next birch tree. Mason wore no armor and carried no tool. His skin looked ordinary: brown hair, gray tunic, dark boots. His player name floated above his head. Mason. The other player raised one arm. Steve waited for his voice. None came. He opened the player list. Mason's name appeared beside his own, but Mason's connection bars were black. Where did you respawn? Steve asked. Mason turned west and began walking. Steve followed at a distance. What happened in the tunnel? No answer. Where is your gear? The figure continued through the birch trees. It never jumped over a block. It walked directly into each rise, paused, then stepped up with the stiff precision of a mob using a player model. Steve selected his bow. Stop! Mason stopped. Turn around. The figure turned. Its face had no eyes. The ordinary skin remained, but two flat squares of fog occupied the places where the eyes should have been. Its mouth opened into vertical red and white bars. Steve fired. The arrow passed through the figure. Mason's shape burst apart into smoke, and every birch tree around Steve vanished at once. The fog closed over him. He held the tear high. Blue light returned in a weak circle. Beyond it, dozens of player shapes stood among trees that were no longer there. Each had Mason's name above its head. Each faced Steve. Black connection bars filled the player list from top to bottom. Then the real chat opened. Mason whispered to you, "Do not follow my skin." Steve typed with one hand. Steve whispered to Mason, "Where are you?" The reply took several seconds. Mason whispered to you, "Spawn." Steve looked at his compass. The needle spun without settling. Steve whispered to Mason, "Our beds are gone." Mason whispered to you, "First spawn." The Western Desert. The original world's spawn lay more than 4,000 blocks away, near the sandstone shelter Steve had abandoned. Mason must have returned there after dying, stripped of every item. The voice channel was gone, but private text still crossed the fog. Steve whispered to Mason, "Stay there." Mason whispered to you, "Cannot." A moment later, another message appeared. Mason whispered to you, "He is already here." All the false player figures moved at once. They ran towards Steve without footsteps. He pushed through them, holding the tier ahead. Their bodies dissolved in its light, but each vanished copy reappeared closer. Their mouths opened around the same four-note whistle. Steve sprinted toward the village. The fog had erased the outer farms and most of the houses. Only the bell tower remained, preserved inside a ring of deep slate. The robed villager stood beneath it with 3 ordinary villagers and the cracked iron golem. The tier's light widened as Steve approached. Fog withdrew from the tower, revealing a trap door beside the bell. The robed villager opened it. Steve climbed down and closed the entrance above him. The false players gathered outside. Their footsteps were silent, but their shadows crossed the gaps between deep slate blocks. Below the tower was a chamber Steve had never seen. Shelves held cassettes, books, and maps. 4 recorders stood along one wall. A 5th sat in the center beside an ender chest. Candles lit symbols carved into the floor. The villager placed a dark cassette into Steve's hand. Cassette 4, the last player. Steve inserted it into the center recorder. For several seconds, it played only the sound of wind across an empty biome. Then the younger voice from the mineshaft began to speak. There were 6 of us when the fog appeared. We thought numbers would protect us. It learned our skins, our voices, and the messages we used when we were separated. Every player it erased became another shape in the fog. Above them, the false masons began striking the trapdoor. Only one of us reached the original spawn. The compass knew the place even when the world did not. The tier knew it too. It is not merely a drop. It is a preserved fragment of the world before the fog. Carry it to the first block that remembered you. Steve opened the old map on the table. Most of it was white. In the far west, one small square of desert remained brown and gold. At the first spawn, hold an ordinary book. Drop the tier beside you. Let the hunter deliver the final hit. If the pattern is complete, death will stop at half a heart. The hunter and the tier will be consumed, and the book will carry what remains. The tape crackled. Do not attempt it elsewhere. You may survive, but the fog will not close. The ritual must happen where your world first learned your name. The recording ended with a final sentence in the older voice. If 2 players remain, only one can be remembered. The trapdoor broke. Fog poured down the ladder. False masons crawled through the opening, their blank eyes fixed on Steve. The iron golem caught the first and threw it against the wall. Its body burst into smoke. The robed villager rang the bell above, and the sound traveled through the chamber like a shockwave. Every copy froze. Steve gathered the map and cassettes. The villager opened the ender chest. Inside was a single lodestone compass pointing west. Steve took it. The ordinary villagers crowded into a side passage. The robed one remained beside the bell rope. Steve understood. Come with us. The villager shook his head. He rang the bell again. The frozen copies cracked across their faces. Steve entered the side passage with the others. The iron golem followed, scraping its shoulders against the stone. Behind them, the bell rang a 3rd time. White light filled the stairwell. Then the tower, the bell, and the robed villager were gone. The tunnel continued west into darkness. Chapter 6. The Village That Forgot the Sun. The underground passage ended beneath the ruined portal where Steve had lived in the desert. It should have taken days to reach it. The coordinates proved that the tunnel crossed more than 4,000 blocks, yet Steve and the villagers walked for less than an hour. The fog had removed so much of the world that distance no longer behaved properly. Sometimes one step moved them a single block. Sometimes the next step carried them across an entire biome. The tunnel walls changed as they traveled. Stone became granite, Granite became sandstone, and sandstone became netherrack. Without a portal between veins of ore ran in impossible vertical lines. Steve saw the cut end of an abandoned mine shaft, a stronghold corridor sealed behind glass, and a drowned ocean monument hanging beyond a gap where water should have been. The three villagers stayed close to the iron golem. Steve kept the tear in hand, using its light to hold back the fog that leaked through cracks. Mason sent messages every few minutes. Mason whispered to you, "Shelter still here." Then Mason whispered to you, "Found your old chest." Then Mason whispered to you, "There is a second me outside." Steve replied whenever the tunnel allowed it. Steve whispered to Mason, "Do not look away from it." Mason whispered to you, "I know." Steve whispered to Mason, "I am close." Mason whispered to you, "So is he." The passage rose through sand. Steve dug the final block and emerged inside his old shelter. Nothing there had changed since day 47. The furnace still held 3 pieces of charcoal. A crafting table stood beside a double chest. Sandstone walls surrounded a red bed, and an oak trapdoor covered the entrance. Through a narrow window, the desert shone beneath midday sun. For the first time since the fog reached the village, Steve could see the sky. Mason stood on the opposite side of the room, wearing spare gold armor from the chest. He held a stone sword in one hand and kept his eyes fixed on the window. "Tell me something the fog would not know," Steve said. Mason did not turn. "Your first redstone door trapped you inside because you placed the repeater backward. Everyone on the server saw that. You named the Grey Cat Furnace because it slept on the furnace, and you never told anyone you had used a name tag." Steve lowered his bow. Mason finally faced him. His eyes were ordinary. His connection bars had returned to green. "Tell me what happened," Steve said. Mason sat beside the old furnace and kept his stone sword across his knees. The ender pearl from the windowless house had carried him above the fog, but not far enough. He landed in the branches of a birch tree while Steve ran toward the village. From there he saw the pale layer remove the lake 1 square at a time. When the hunter turned toward him, Mason climbed down and entered the water tunnel through its broken western branch. "I thought I could lead it away from you," he said. Then the tunnel stopped matching the one we built. Every turn brought him back to the same abandoned mineshaft. Torches appeared ahead and vanished behind. He passed the same chest minecart 6 times. On the 7th, someone was sitting inside it wearing Mason's skin. Mason had disconnected. For several minutes, he waited outside the world. The server list still showed 1 player online, then 2, then 31. Every name was Mason. When the count returned to 1, he joined again. The hunter was waiting on the exact block where he had left. It killed him before the terrain finished loading. "I saw the death screen," Mason said. "But the respawn button had no words. It was just a grey rectangle." He pressed it and woke in the western desert beneath full daylight. His inventory was empty. Steve's old shelter stood nearby. At first, Mason believed he had escaped. Then he found himself already inside the shelter, looking out through the window. The copy did not move when Mason moved. It watched the eastern horizon. Every few minutes, it turned its head a little farther until it was looking directly backward at him. "Why did you whistle?" Steve asked. "I did not. I sent the whispers and stayed here." Steve thought of the 4 notes that had led him through the fog. Then the copies know our signals. They know everything the world remembers. Mason picked up the stone sword. We have to rely on something we have not done before. They exchanged no long greeting. Steve gave him iron armor, a shield, food, and a diamond sword from the old chest. Mason read the map and listened while Steve described the ritual. "Only one can be remembered," Mason said. A cassette said that. It may be wrong. The first cassette was right about everything else. Then we changed the rule. Mason looked through the window again. The false copy of him stood on a dune 50 blocks away, watching the shelter. "We need the exact spawn block," he said. Steve checked the lodestone compass. The needle pointed beneath the floor. They removed sandstone and found a grass block buried under the shelter. It did not belong in a desert. Green grass covered its top and a single poppy grew from it despite the lack of sunlight. When Steve stepped onto the block, his screen flickered. For one moment, the desert returned to the way it had looked on the first day. No shelter, no ruined portal, no torches. Steve saw himself standing beneath the square sun with an empty hotbar. Beside him stood Mason in the plain clothes of a new player. Then the shelter returned. "This is the block," Steve said. Mason began building. He used the materials Steve had left behind weeks earlier: redstone dust, pistons, iron bars, dispensers, and obsidian mined from the ruined portal. Around the grass block, he made 3 concentric rings. The first ring held water dispensers to push fog away. The second held powdered snow and cobwebs to slow the hunter. The third was a wall of obsidian with piston gates at 4 points. Steve brewed potions in the old stand: healing, regeneration, and swiftness. The cassette guide warned that having speed active during the ritual would change the enchantment. Steve did not know which result they needed, so he kept the swiftness potion separate. The villagers formed a temporary settlement beneath the shelter. Steve placed beds and workstations in the tunnel. The iron golem guarded the stairs. For several minutes the room sounded almost peaceful. Villagers working, a furnace burning, redstone pistons clicking as Mason tested each circuit. The small calm did not last. At sunset, the false Mason disappeared from the dune. The desert fog arrived from every direction. It rolled over the sand in square layers, swallowing cacti and dead bushes. The sky remained clear above it. Sunset colored the top of the fog orange, while everything below turned gray. Mason closed the trapdoor. "How long?" "Until it reaches us. Less than 2 minutes. Until he changes. 30 seconds unwatched to move closer, around 45 to hunt. Then we watch." The man appeared on the eastern dune. Steve and Mason stood at separate windows, both keeping him in view. White eyes shone against the sunset. The creature remained still. Fog reached the first torch and removed it. Then the second. Steve backed toward the ritual chamber while Mason watched from the other angle. They alternated, one keeping the crosshair fixed while the other moved supplies. The man did not advance. Night rose behind him. The first stars appeared. The creature tilted his head. One of the villagers tried to sleep below. The warning appeared to both players. "You cannot sleep while he is near." The man raised an arm and pointed south. A player stood there in the fog. It wore Steve's skin. Another Steve appeared to the north. A third stood at the western window. Each had white fog where the eyes should have been. Mason kept looking at the original creature. Copies. I ignore them. One false Steve entered the shelter through the closed trap door, as though the block were not present. It walked behind Mason and raised a diamond axe. Steve fired. The copy vanished. In the half-second that Steve looked away, the man crossed the eastern dune. He now stood directly outside the window. White eyes filled the opening. Mason pulled the piston lever. Obsidian slid across the glass. The man whistled. "Ritual room," Steve said. They descended. Above them the hunter tore through sandstone. Blocks vanished in quick, heavy bursts. The iron golem moved to meet it. Villagers crowded into the western passage. Mason armed the traps. "Drop the tier. Hold the book. I will open the gate when he reaches the center." Steve stepped onto the buried grass block. He selected the book. The tier would not leave his other hand. He tried dropping it. The item appeared over the block for a fraction of a second, then returned to his inventory. It is not working. The iron golem struck something above. A deep roar shook sand from the ceiling. Steve dropped the tier again. It returned. Mason looked at the pattern. The world does not think both players are present. What? The tape said only one can be remembered. Your player list has copies of me. The spawn block cannot tell which one is real. The golem crashed through the ceiling and landed beside them. Its body broke into iron ingots and poppies. Fog followed through the hole. Mason pushed the villagers into the tunnel. "The ritual will not begin while I am here." "We do not know that." "We know the tier rejects the pattern." The hunter dropped into the room. Mason activated the dispensers. Water burst from 4 walls and carried the creature into cobwebs. Powdered snow fell from the ceiling. Pistons closed iron bars around its limbs. For a few seconds the trap held. Steve swung at the hunter with his axe. Mason attacked from the opposite side. The creature flashed red with each blow, but showed no sign of weakening. It had survived arrows, lava, golems, dripstone, and drowning. Killing it by force was never the true plan. The hunter broke one iron bar. Then another. Mason threw Steve the lodestone compass. "Take the western tunnel." "This is the spawn block." "No, it is a memory of the block. Look at the compass." The needle pointed west, not down. As fog touched the green block, the poppy vanished. Sand replaced the grass. The real original spawn had moved, preserved somewhere ahead of the destruction. Steve took the tier and book. The 2 players entered the western tunnel just as the hunter broke free. Behind them, the desert shelter disappeared into fog. Chapter 7: 200 Blocks. The compass led Steve and Mason through pieces of the world that should never have touched. They left the desert tunnel and stepped directly into a snowy taiga. 20 blocks later, the snow ended at the shore of a warm ocean. Beyond the water stood a ruined savanna village, with icebergs floating behind it. The fog had not merely removed terrain. It had pulled the surviving pieces together, closing gaps like torn pages pressed into the same book. The villagers could not keep pace, so Mason sealed them inside a deep slate chamber with beds, food, and the 3 surviving cassettes. Steve repaired the iron door and left the strong healing potion in a chest. "When the fog ends, we come back," he said. The villagers murmured. One farmer held out a single emerald. Steve accepted it, though there was nothing left to trade. He and Mason followed the compass alone. The first surviving fragment ahead was the ruined savannah village they had seen from the tunnel. Its acacia houses leaned over a dry ravine, each foundation ending at a different height. One farm had been cut cleanly in half. Water from its irrigation trench poured into open air and became rain before reaching the darkness below. Steve and Mason crossed the village for supplies. The chests contained little: 2 apples, a saddle, 5 pieces of bread, and an iron helmet with almost no durability remaining. They took the food and left the rest. No villagers lived there, but every door stood open, as though the inhabitants had departed together. At the village center, a bell hung from a frame of dark oak rather than acacia. Beneath it was a sign: "Ring once if you are real." Mason walked around the frame, checking for redstone. Someone wants an answer, or something wants our location. It already has our location. Mason rang the bell once. The note traveled across the broken land. A second bell answered from beyond the ocean. Then a third answered behind them. Steve turned. The hanging man clung upside down beneath the roof of the largest house. His eyes were closed. The bell rope continued moving below him, although no one touched it. "Walk," Steve said. "Do not run." They moved toward the western edge of the village. The hanging man remained above the bell. At each corner, Steve looked back and held the figure in view. Mason watched the path ahead. The compass led them into the ravine. A staircase had been carved down one wall. Signs marked every landing with a number: 200, 1 Hendry, 160, 140. The count decreased as they descended, though the bottom was no more than 30 blocks below the surface. At the final landing, the sign read 0. A small room had been dug into the stone. Inside stood 2 beds, a furnace, and a recorder without a cassette. Tallies covered the walls. Most came in groups of 5. Some had been carved over earlier marks until the stone looked black. Mason examined the beds. 2 players lived here. Steve looked at the tallies. They were counting chases. On the back wall, a message had been written in charcoal. 200 blocks is his range. Below it in smaller letters: "The fog has no range." The recorder clicked. Steve and Mason faced it. Its slot was empty, but the reels began turning. Their own voices played from its speaker. "Someone wants an answer," Mason's recorded voice said. "Or something wants our location," Steve's voice replied. The exchange had happened less than a minute earlier at the bell. The recorder played the bell note. Beneath it, almost too low to hear, a whistle descended through 3 tones. Steve broke the recorder. The reels continued turning on the floor. They left the room and climbed the staircase. The numbered signs had changed. Everyone now read 0. At the top, the savannah village was full of players. Copies of Steve and Mason stood in every doorway. Some wore their current armor. Others wore the skins and equipment from earlier days. Steve in desert iron, Mason carrying shulker boxes, both of them unarmed on the world's first morning. None moved while the players watched. The hanging man no longer clung beneath the roof. "Which one is him?" Mason asked. Steve scanned the copies, "The one we cannot see." They walked between the silent figures. Each copy turned its head to follow them. The tier's blue light weakened their shapes but did not remove them. These were not ordinary fog shadows. They were memories rooted in the surviving village blocks. At the western farm, a copy of Mason held out its hand. A dark droplet rested on its palm. Steve checked his inventory. The real tier was still there. The copy opened its barred mouth. "Only one can be remembered," it said in Mason's voice. Mason struck it with his sword. The shape shattered, and every other copy rushed forward. Steve placed water from the irrigation trench. The current swept several figures into the ravine, where they dissolved before reaching the bottom. He and Mason jumped onto the farm wall, crossed the roof of a house, and reached the ocean seam. The copy stopped at the last dry block. Dozens of blank faces watched from the village while Mason placed the boat. High above them, a black figure crawled across the underside of a cloud. Its white eyes opened. The needle pointed across the warm ocean. They built a boat and pushed away from shore. For half a minute, only oars and water disturbed the quiet. Tropical fish moved beneath them. A ruined portal passed below, purple obsidian visible through clear blue water. The moon rose behind the icebergs. Then the whistle came from under the boat. Steve looked down. The man stood on the ocean floor, 30 blocks below. White eyes followed them through the water. His long arms swayed with the current, but his feet remained planted in sand. "Keep rowing," Steve said. "I will watch." Mason rowed west. Steve faced backward, holding the man in view. The figure grew smaller as the boat traveled. Fog spread across the ocean floor behind him. At 100 blocks, the creature vanished. Steve searched left and right. "Do you see him?" Mason asked. "No." The boat rocked. Long black fingers curled over the stern. Mason turned sharply. Steve struck the hand with his axe. The boat broke beneath them. They fell into the ocean. The man hung in the water between them, his face still and white-eyed. Steve held the tier. Its blue glow opened a clear sphere in the fog, but it did not push the creature back. The whistle began. They swam. Mason placed a boat on the surface, and both climbed in before the final note. He rowed, while Steve watched behind. The man moved across the water on all fours, sometimes swimming below them, sometimes climbing onto the surface. Darkness covered the edges of the world. The chase had begun. An iceberg rose ahead. Mason turned around it, using the sharp corner to break line of sight. The hunter climbed over the ice instead of following the boat. It dropped from the top and landed in the water beside them. Steve fired his last arrow into its mouth. The creature recoiled. Mason rowed through a narrow channel between two ice walls, then jumped out on the far side. They climbed. The hunter came up the vertical ice behind them, long fingers piercing the blocks. Steve reached the top and poured a water bucket down the face. Mason placed soul sand at the base, turning the stream into a bubble column. The rising bubbles threw the creature upward faster. "That was the wrong block," Steve said. "I noticed." They ran across the iceberg. Ahead, a dark oak forest began without shoreline. Ice ended at grass in a straight vertical seam. They crossed it. The canopies swallowed the moonlight. The hanging men filled the trees. Dozens of black bodies hung upside down from the leaves, eyes closed and arms dangling. Steve and Mason moved beneath them as quietly as running players could move. The hunter's pursuit shook branches behind them. One hanging figure opened its eyes. Then another. White squares appeared throughout the canopy like stars. The figures dropped. Most dissolved into fog when they hit the ground, but every impact removed grass and leaves. Holes opened across the path. Steve jumped one. Mason fell into another and caught the edge with a water bucket. The hunter reached the pit above him. Steve threw the ender pearl Mason had saved from the first escape. It struck the wall beside Mason, teleporting Steve into the hole. He hit the hunter with his shield, pushing it back just enough for Mason to climb. The creature struck Steve. His iron chest plate broke. 9 hearts disappeared. Mason threw the strong healing potion, but it had been left with the villagers. He used an ordinary golden apple instead, forcing it into Steve's hand. They ran while regeneration restored 2 hearts at a time. The compass pointed through a cliff. Mason began mining, but Steve stopped him. When he loses sight, he breaks harder blocks. Going around takes too long. The hunter entered the clearing behind them. Mason dug a 2-block tunnel. Steve faced backward, keeping the creature in sight until the last possible moment. Then he entered and placed obsidian behind them. The hunter struck it. The obsidian cracked. "It can break that now," Mason said. "The fog is stronger." They mined forward together. Stone opened into an underground stronghold library. Bookshelves rose 2 stories around them, untouched by fog. Cobwebs stretched between railings. An end portal frame was visible through an iron door in the far wall. The compass pointed toward it. Steve and Mason crossed the library. Behind them, the obsidian barrier broke. Fog entered and removed bookshelves row by row. Pages filled the air for an instant before vanishing. The portal room contained 12 empty frames. At the center, where lava should have been, a single grass block floated above the floor. A red poppy grew on it. The original spawn. "How did it get here?" Mason asked. Steve looked at the end portal frames. Each contained a dark blue shape instead of an eye of ender, 12 carvings of the tear. The world moved it somewhere the fog could not easily reach. The hunter entered the library. Mason closed the iron door and barred it with stone. Steve stepped onto the grass. The lodestone compass pointed straight down and stopped moving. He dropped the tear. This time it stayed on the ground. Blue light traveled through the portal frames. One by one, the 12 dark carvings opened like eyes. The grass spread across the floor, replacing stone. The poppy multiplied until a small field filled the room. Steve held the plain book. The iron door bent inward. "When he gets through, do not attack," Steve said. Mason took position beside the portal. "The tape said the hunter has to deliver the killing blow." "I know. And only one player can be remembered." "The tape may mean one player must stand on the block, or it means exactly what it said." The door vanished. Fog flooded the stronghold. The hunter crawled through the opening with red eyes burning. Mason triggered a fire charge dispenser. A line of redstone lit around the portal room. Pistons pushed obsidian between Steve and the creature, buying a few more seconds. "You built this now?" Steve asked. "I have been placing dust since the library." "It is terrible. It only needs to work once." The hunter broke the first obsidian block. Mason stepped out of the circle. The 12 blue lights dimmed. "Come back," Steve said. The ritual has chosen. Mason. Mason placed his diamond sword on the grass beside Steve. Then he emptied his inventory, the compass, the remaining food, an iron pickaxe, a water bucket, and the emerald from the farmer. If it remembers both of us, perhaps the fog returns through both of us, he said. If it remembers one, it should be the player holding the tear. The hunter broke the second block. Mason backed into the library. Do not do this. Finish the story, Steve. He pulled the lever. The pistons reversed. The obsidian gates opened toward Mason instead of Steve. The hunter turned and followed him into the fog. Chapter 8. The Last Block of Morning. Steve stood alone inside the ring of portal frames. The tear hovered above the grass. The book trembled in his hand. Beyond the open door, red eyes moved between the library shelves as the hunter followed Mason. Steve picked up the diamond sword and ran after them. The blue lights around the ritual circle went dark, but the tear remained on the ground. The ritual was waiting. He did not know how long it would wait. Mason had reached the upper balcony. He fired arrows down through the fog, drawing the hunter away from the portal room. Bookshelves disappeared beneath its claws. Cobwebs slowed it for a moment, then broke apart. "Go back!" Mason shouted over voice chat. The channel had returned. "We find another way," Steve replied. "There is no time. Then we make time." Steve poured water from the balcony. It pushed the hunter across the lower floor. Mason jumped into the current and rode it down. Together they reached the iron door and entered a stronghold corridor. The chase carried them through prison cells, staircases, and rooms buried behind stone. Silverfish emerged from broken blocks. The hunter crushed them without noticing. Fog followed, erasing every corridor they left. There could be no return route except through the creature itself. Mason counted aloud. 20 seconds. The hunter struck the wall beside Steve. 25. They crossed a ravine where the stronghold had been cut by a cave. Mason built a bridge while Steve held his shield against the creature's blows. 32. The shield broke. Steve lost 4 hearts. He ate the final golden apple. 40. They reached a dead end. The hunter crouched at the far side of the ravine, preparing to jump. Red eyes narrowed. Fog filled the space beneath it. 45, Mason said. The creature leaped. Mason placed a single oak plank at the end of the bridge and stepped onto it. Steve understood too late. The plank was attached to a piston hidden beneath the stone. Mason had placed the last components as they ran. He pulled a lever. The piston retracted. Mason fell into the ravine. The hunter followed him down. Steve reached the edge. Far below, lava lit the walls. Mason landed in a stream of water and survived with half a heart. The hunter struck stone beside him. "Run," Steve shouted. Mason looked up, back to the circle. Then he whistled 4 notes. The hunter turned toward him. Mason ran into a tunnel at the bottom of the ravine. The creature followed. Steve heard the chase receding through the stone. He had perhaps 50 seconds. Steve sprinted back through the stronghold. The fog had erased most corridors, leaving open gaps into caves and void dark spaces. He followed the trail of redstone Mason had placed. Dust glowed on the remaining blocks, a thin red road leading home. Behind him, the death message appeared. Mason was slain by the man from the fog. Steve stopped for one heartbeat. The chat added another line. Mason left the game. No whistle followed. No false message announced his return. Steve continued. He reached the library as darkness covered his vision. The hunter had left Mason's tunnel and was coming back. Bookshelves collapsed into fog. White noise filled the stronghold. Steve entered the portal room. The tier still hovered above the original spawn block. The poppy field had withered to a single flower. He stepped onto the grass and held the book. Blue light opened in the 12 frames. The fog stopped at the doorway. The hunter walked through it. Its eyes were red, its limbs covered in arrows and burn marks from every trap. It had crossed deserts, oceans, forests, mines, villages, and strongholds. It had broken doors, glass, stone, iron, and obsidian. It had learned players' skins and voices. It had followed Steve farther than 200 blocks and waited beside every bed. Now it stood 3 blocks away. Steve dropped the diamond sword. The hunter paused. He dropped the pickaxe, the axe, the bow, and the last healing potion. He kept only the plain book in his hands. "I am looking at you," Steve said. The creature's red eyes faded to white. For the first time, it stepped backward. The fog moved behind it like a living wall. False players appeared inside the pale air. The robed villager, the vanished farmers, the cartographer and mason. Their eyes were blank. Their mouths opened around silent words. Steve understood what the fog wanted. It had never hunted merely to kill. It needed him to run, build, mine, and hide. Every change he made gave it more of the world to consume. Every shelter became another memory. Every escape opened new blocks. The man was the pair of hands the fog used to reach those memories. The ritual offered a different memory. One player, one book, one choice not to run. Steve looked away. The hunter crossed the distance. Darkness became complete. The whistle rose note by note until it filled every part of the game. Steve held the book against his chest. The tear shone at his feet. The first blow removed 8 hearts. Steve did not move. The second broke his remaining armor. Half a heart remained. The hunter lifted both arms for the final strike. Mason's false shape appeared beside it. For one instant, his eyes were ordinary. He nodded. The final blow landed. Steve's screen flashed white. He saw the red and white bars of the creature's mouth expand across his vision. He heard a burst of sound louder than thunder. The death screen began to form, its first grey letters appearing over the world. Then the letters broke apart. The tear shattered into blue particles. The hunter froze. Cracks of the same blue light crossed its black body from its feet to its head. The long arms folded inward, its barred mouth closed, the white eyes dimmed. Fog rushed out of the portal room. It pulled backward through the stronghold, drawing false players with it. The copied villagers vanished first. The copied Steve shapes stretched into smoke. Mason's shape remained beside the hunter until the last moment. 4 quiet notes passed through the room. Then he was gone. The man collapsed into the book in Steve's hands. Its cover changed from brown leather to black, with a single blue symbol at the center. Pale letters appeared above the hotbar. Fog protection. Steve fell onto the grass with half a heart. For several minutes he did not move. Morning light entered through cracks in the stronghold ceiling. The square sun rose over a world with enormous pieces missing. The fog had gone, but it had not returned anything it had destroyed. The portal room remained. The grass block still floated at its center. Around it lay Steve's tools, Mason's diamond sword, and the emerald from the farmer. Steve picked up the sword last. The player list contained only one name. He followed the tunnel back to the deep slate chamber. The 3 villagers were alive. Their beds remained. The cassettes had become blank rectangles without labels, and every recorder was silent. Steve opened the iron door. Outside, the warm ocean touched a snowy tiger along an impossible border, but the water no longer disappeared. The farmer recognized the emerald and offered bread in return. Steve declined the trade and gave the emerald back. They traveled east over the following days. Without fog, distance returned to normal. The surviving pieces of the world were scattered and strange, but the compass pointed toward the old lake. Steve built bridges across missing chunks, stairs down sheer edges, and lantern posts wherever night made the road difficult to follow. He did not sleep until the 3rd night. When he finally placed a red bed beneath the open sky, no warning appeared. Stars moved above him. Zombies groaned beyond the torchlight. A spider climbed a nearby cliff and waited like an ordinary spider. Steve slept. Morning came. At the lake, very little remained. Most of the water had drained into the exposed caves. Half the hill was gone. The stone foundation of the house ended above empty air, and the village paths led to plots of grass where no buildings stood. The bell had vanished. The iron golem had vanished. The grey cat named Furnace was nowhere among the ruins. Steve searched until sunset. At the edge of the former wheat field, he found one fence post. A lantern still hung from it, unlit but intact. Beneath the post lay Mason's first shulker box. Inside were oak slabs from the dock, red stone components, 3 name tags, and a written book. The book contained no grand explanation. Mason had used it for building measurements. The final page listed the hilltop house, 17 blocks wide, 11 blocks deep, roof peak at 9. Beneath the measurements, he had added one sentence. Make the road wider next time. Steve closed the book. He spent the next day rebuilding the lantern road. He made it 3 blocks wide, with stone brick edges and oak posts every 12 blocks. The villagers settled beside it. One became a farmer, another a librarian, and the 3rd tended a new stonecutter. Steve built homes where the old paths ended, though he did not try to copy the missing village exactly. Some things could be remembered without being recreated block for block. He repaired the lake by closing the largest caves and guiding river water into the basin. He planted wheat on the hill. He built the new house with narrow windows, a deep stone foundation, and 2 exits. Above the door he hung the black enchanted book. Beside the rebuilt dock, Steve placed a block of polished deep slate. He fixed an item frame to its eastern side and set Mason's final redstone comparator inside. There was no grave beneath it. The world had left no body and returned no items from the ravine. The small marker simply faced the sunrise and the house they had designed together. The librarian placed a lectern beside the stone. Steve added Mason's building book, opened to the final page. Villagers gathered around it at sunset, murmuring over measurements they could not read. Steve did not write a death date. Dates belonged to worlds that kept an honest count of their days. Instead, he carved 4 short lines into the pathstone, one for each note Mason had used to lead him through the mines. The next morning, the grey cat appeared beside the marker. Furnace was thin, and one ear showed a line of missing texture, but the name still floated above the animal. The cat sniffed the deep slate, jumped onto the comparator, and sat facing the lake. Steve carried it back to the house. Furnace returned to the memorial twice before choosing the new furnace as its sleeping place. The fog never returned. Weeks passed. The dark oak forest grew quiet. Rain fell on the roof Steve had wanted since leaving the desert. Bees moved between poppies beside the road. At night, ordinary mobs approached the fence and burned in the morning. Steve kept Mason's sword in a frame above the crafting table. On the 100th day, he walked to the end of the completed road carrying one final lantern. The square sun had just risen. Gold light spread over the restored water, touched the village roofs, and reached the place where the windowless house had once stood beyond the trees. Steve placed the lantern on the last oak post. For a moment he thought he heard 4 notes from the far shore. He waited, listening to the water and the bees. The sound did not come again. Steve lit the lantern, turned toward the village, and walked home as the last block of morning brightened behind him.